He will talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll have a chance for some discussion afterwards. So Dr. Sarukkai this is the first time I have ever introduced a particle physicist. I'm quite pleased about this. He has a master's in physics from the Indian Institute of Technology, a PhD in particle physics from Purdue University in the US. But during the course of his doctoral studies in physics, he became more and more interested in questions of philosophy and the philosophy of science. And his series of publications and books since then have reflected that. His first book was titled Translating the World, Science and Language. His second book was on the philosophy of symmetry. His third book was looking at, and more connected with what we're going to talk about today, was Indian philosophy and the philosophy of science. Yes, there were more books. His fourth book was a popular introduction to the history and philosophy of science for general readers in India, titled What is Science? He also has a co-authored book with Gopal Guru called The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on experience and theory, raising questions about the dependence on Western theories in describing Indian social experiences. He is currently Professor of Philosophy at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. He's also the founder and director of the Manohar Center for Philosophy and Humanities, and previously a fellow of the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. So he is truly a Renaissance man, if that weren't such a European way of describing him. So it's a great pleasure to have him here. And I very much look forward to his presentation and to the discussion afterwards. So welcome, Sundar.
Thank you, Professor Kelly. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. When I was, when I had this kind of invitation to speak here, I was wondering what I would actually speak on. And then I was going through the ARC site, and I was really struck by the real diversity of people and topics. And then I wrote a mail to Anna, who invited me earlier here for the conference, and with Anna and Philip, just sharing some thoughts, very random ideas of what I could speak on, because after I saw the work being done here, and very kindly, Professor Kelly immediately. You could even hear the title of my talk, so that was wonderful. And I said, it's something which I would like to do. And what I actually wanted to do was, as I said, in responding to the kind of work here, I wanted to place before you certain questions which animate some of us working in these areas of now largely philosophy and social sciences and natural sciences. And I wanted it to be in the spirit of a dialogue, because if it is in the spirit of a dialogue, I can say certain polemical things and get away with it, rather than a formal lecture of a particular kind. But it's more to share certain concerns that we have in our own practices, in our community. Now I'm bringing this to your community, in the sense, and the our and your is not in any sense specific to any kind of, not even about geographies. I'm talking about very specific locations of where we are and the kind of work that we do. So I thought I would place that before you and give you a rationale for why these questions trouble us and why we think topics like this should become part of our mainstream reflections. And since my concern for the last few years has been deeply on the question of education also, and in this larger science project which Gordon has been kind enough to involve us with for the last few years, this is a question we've been talking to the science and technology, the STS community in Canada, which has been very hospitable to these ideas. This is a question which is also about what do we then do with these differing perspectives on what it is to do academics, what it is to study societies and so on. So I'm going to take the liberty of sharing these points with you, with the hope that there will be many disagreements, of course, but with the hope that there will be at least something insightful about what I might say. So the first point I want to begin with is the rationale for this itself, and the rationale for talking about non-Western traditions itself. And there are many reasons why the question of non-Western traditions become important to us in India. Part of it is the fact that we don't teach in so-called Indian or Chinese or African traditions within our own structures. It's very difficult to find, for example, good programs in Indian philosophy, if you are looking for philosophy programs. So this is reflected in, as far as I know, in many countries in Asia. So there is this challenge about how we understand ourselves and how we receive ourselves in our own intellectual traditions, right? And we are trying to make sense of it, because if we raise this question in India, and this question is no longer an academic question, it also becomes a political question. Because immediately there are questions of nationalism, etc., etc. So every time we talk about this, you have to sidestep it, talk about it carefully, qualify it in many different ways. So there is one kind of a concern for us. So I'm just going to give you a list of things which we think are the reasons why we need to take this question seriously, at least for us. The second, of course, is a much larger and more deeply engaging question, which is the fact that the global world, in which all of us are participants, has been deeply influenced by the imagination of just few communities. At least that would be the claim we would make, and I'm sure some of you can challenge that. That this could be the corporate imagination. It's not about, not even about countries' imagination. I'm saying it could be about these different kinds of imaginations. But it seems to be the fact that we are caught in a world which is being created for us, in which we have very little say. I was in this STS conference here, we just finished 2 days back, and one of the points we were talking about was just that, which is that India and China, for example, have the highest amount of science and technology manpower in the world. Individually they have two or three, or second or third or whatever. And if you combine the two, they far exceed the scientific and technological manpower in the rest of the world. And yet, if you look at the theoretical reflections on science and technology studies, their work in, for example, in contributions in philosophy of science or even sociology of science, the amount of impact they have had on that still seems to be minimal. That the kind of work you are actually reading, the people who make sense to you, who help you make sense of science and technology, seem to be absent from a very large tradition. In the sense, I'm not just saying India and China, it includes Africa, it includes an enormous number of people of the world who don't seem to have a say in the imagination of science and technology in which we all belong and which we all share. So, this is a question of a kind of the imagination of the world and our own attempts to stake a claim in the imagination of the world. And we want to say, where is our voice and where is our vision in the imagination of the world? And I'm sure, since all of you are from social sciences and humanities, you will find my use of the hour very problematical, and I want to bracket it and keep it as a problematical. I don't want to clarify that here, okay? In the sense, I want you to give me the freedom to use I could be talking about India, I could be talking about Asia. I want it to be sort of loose and very pragmatically, I want to exploit with your permission. Actually, with your kindness, because then if you ask me difficult questions about it will be a very problematical question. But it is true that we have a problem with the imagination which we think is being imposed on us. And it may come through science and technology, it may come through modern capitalist structures, it may come through various other institutional power structures all of us experience. So we want to have a say and we want to see how do we fit our vision of the world into this. Other than the fact, the examples of science and technology is an example of the numbers which we have in India, in Asia, and so on. But even otherwise, in terms of the larger imagination, space of imagination we have for these communities, somebody is telling us that India and China's population is 2.7 billion. That's a very, very significant percentage of the world population. And today, when we talk of India and China, very often you talk in terms of economic markets, in terms of how they are very important in the future understanding of the world. But this question about it's not just about the Asian context, not just about the numbers. The equivalent, there are two very significant impact of this, one on the West and one on the Northwest. So the first one, the West, when I use Canada as a model, that the West in this sense, like the Canadian model, is becoming far more and more heterogeneous. It's very difficult to really classify in a very specific way what you mean by the West without a kind of an amalgamation of various other communities in it. And therefore it becomes very important for the West to find paradigms for engaging with the various others around you. And this is one kind of a problem, which is a political science. I mean, every culture studies, everybody is engaging this question of others and how do you make sense of them, how do you construct societies like this. For the non-West, for me, there are other kinds of challenges, which is what I want to discuss here. I mean, because these others are discussed very well, and many of you are probably greater experts at than this. But I am interested in posing these three questions as a point to take off. For the non-West, the three basic challenges I'll set out here. One is, there is an asymmetry of knowledge production. And the example I told you of STS is just one example of that. You can see this in philosophy, for example. You can see it in social theory, for example. And one of the ironic things that we have, which again Indian social scientists have commented, if you do a course, let's say MA in sociology, for example, if you want to look at the basic theories of caste that we study in India in sociology, as part of Indian sociology, the most important writers are Weber, Durkheim, Dumont. In other words, the way in which the country or the Indian social reality has been represented to the people who belong to that social reality comes from very important scholars. I don't want to negate the importance of any of these thinkers, very deeply insightful, people have put in enormous work trying to make sense of it. But that's the way in which knowledge is being produced and communicated to our students. So we're talking about tradition of an academic tradition where the reflections on the society, the knowledge production from the society seems to come from elsewhere, whatever the elsewhere is. So today, for example, if you really want to study, social theories, I was in a conference in IIT Delhi on Habermas, and there were some 20 papers on Habermas. It ranges from using Habermas to study, of course, the public spaces, but also using Habermas to see how you look at a Hindi film in a Bombay theatre, how you use Habermas to drink coffee and so on. Sorry, I'm just being nasty. What I'm saying is that, the kind of, the theoretical structure to make sense of your experiences. The question is, where are you finding the resources to do that? And that kind of a question, I think, is a very specific problem for us. I mean, I think it's a larger problem in all academic sphere. What kind of theoretical structures do you use to make sense of whatever you are doing, you're studying? But in the context of the non-West, that becomes one of the fundamental problems. Because the asymmetry of knowledge production also goes into the asymmetry of technology, production of ideas, and so on. This is also related to the question of asymmetry of theoretical reflection. What my good friend and co-author Gopal Guru, who teaches political science at JNU, referred to very famously as theoretical Brahmins and empirical Shudras. He was drawing on the structure of the caste system, where the Brahmins are the hierarchy of Shudras, and he was trying to argue, he was making a very important critique of Indian social science, where he said that, look, the people who are representing the Shudras, or he was talking about the Dalits, and the other, in the caste hierarchy, seem to be the people from forward caste and Brahmins. So the theoretical reflection of the Dalits are not being performed by the Dalits themselves, but needs of these higher caste people to have the capacity to theoretically reflect on them. Now you could rephrase that in a very interesting way. It's a very powerful tool to rephrase it and say, you could say theoretical Germans and empirical Indians. Or you could say theoretical Westerners and empirical Asians, whatever. I want to remove this from questions of troubling politics. That's not really my concern here. But I'm saying that the question is, what kind of theoretical structures do you need? Where are you going to get the resources from in order to reflect on the experiences of what you're studying? So that is the asymmetry of theoretical reflection is present. And finally, the asymmetry of representation. And that also troubles us very deeply. And the asymmetry of representation is very simple. Just like I gave you the example in the caste system, today in India can be studied dominantly by the way in which Weber understands, given his own background and the way he understands Indian society, the caste system, the idea of religion in India and so on. And that is what we teach our students. That's where we begin our initial reflections from. I think in principle that's fine, although it doesn't happen to other societies. That is, the asymmetry of representation is nothing but the problem of an excessive representation of the non-West by West, and the relative, the relative absence of representation of the West by the non-West. And this has very deep implications, and I'm sure many of you know. Canada to me is a model in various ways. I'm just not trying to be nice because I'm here, but I'm saying in contrast, for example, in the US. The example in the US is this: that there have been many students in anthropology, Indian students in anthropology, for example, who have wanted to study American culture, do participant observation on the American society. And they are very well qualified to do it because they are trained in the language of it, they are trained in the world of living of American society. But there are very well documented cases of these students not getting funding or support to do that, because then they are told, you go back and study some other minor culture in your societies. So the point here is this, that how do you enable the conditions that you would have people from different parts of the world coming and reflecting on the nature of Western societies in the way in which anthropology, sociology does vis-a-vis other non-Western societies. And is there, what are the implications of it, etc., is a different question which we can discuss. But this is a problem of asymmetry of representation. So when Gopal Guru was talking about the Brahminical representation of Dalits, and then he was immediately attacked from various quarters and said, how does it mean only Dalits can study Dalits? Does it mean only Indians can study Indians, Canadians study Canadians? What he was suggesting is that is really not the point. The point is that if there is an asymmetry of representation, if there are very few Dalits who self-represent Dalits, and you just have an enormous amount of protection of the nature of Dalits by non-Dalits, that is a problem. So the only point here is that's why I'm saying this is not in that sense that kind of a political problem. It's more a problem about ways of representing and giving an equal playground of possible representations, out of which you can choose or whatever you do within the game of academics. So what the problem we have had with this asymmetry of representation therefore is, for us, we feel that we cannot even understand ourselves properly, because the categories of understanding ourselves have been mediated by very different intellectual traditions. Maybe that is for the better, I don't know. There was a very famous Indian sociologist, psychologist, Ashish Nandi, who many of you may have read. He did this with Vinay Lal, who is a historian at the UCLA. They did this dictionary for the 21st century, whatever. And there was I remember I had an exchange with him about this. There's an article in that, a small chapter on Calcutta. And Calcutta is a very special place in India, right? The people of Calcutta have deep connections to the city. It can raise tempers enormously if you say anything about it. Somebody who said something not very nice about Calcutta wasn't allowed to step off Calcutta airport when his plane was going by and so on. But here is Ashish Nandi, who is originally from Calcutta, gets the article on Calcutta in this handbook on the 20th century, which had various entries, written by an anthropologist with some British and Australian connection. So he was either a British or working in Australia or something around that. And so in the discussion which we had about something, I asked him, I just come back from a visit to Calcutta, and Calcutta is an amazing city, many different ways. And I came back and I told him, I didn't find that article very interesting, but I'm curious why you asked that particular person to write that piece on Calcutta. And he said, he was also, whether he was very happy with the article or not is not the question, but he said, I wanted an outsider's perspective, an outsider to reflect on Calcutta. And this argument that the outsider somehow, which is a very central argument for anthropological enterprises in various societies, that the outsider can bring an objective reflection on a particular society. I was very surprised he used that to legitimize this, because then I asked him, what do you think, suppose there's an equivalent handbook on entries on, let's say, Paris or Toronto or New York, how many non-Westerners do you think they'll go in search of to write about these societies? That's the problem of, and this problem of representation, what it implies. And I said the consequence of it is that if you construct our own experiences now through these categories, which are filtered, I'm not sure that the outsider perspective gives you a very balanced questions. Now, there are many reasons for these asymmetries, and there are, I won't even get into them unless it's during the discussion. The point I want to suggest to you, therefore, is that there is a problem of alternate imaginations which are present, and our task is to make sense of these alternate imaginations in a way in which it is egalitarian, in a way in which it is contributive to our understanding, not just of ourselves, but of other societies. So then you might ask me this question, are there really such alternative imaginations at all? Are there really different ways in which people think about themselves and about the world? And this has been a very important part of our engagement in trying to answer these questions, to say that there is a meaningful difference of imaginations which are present, and that we need to find an account for that. And if that is integrated into the larger collective envisioning or the imagination of the world, we think that would probably be a far better world than the one we live in. And there are many examples of the alternate imaginations which is present to us, many, many examples. You could start with the examples of science and technology, and Indian and Chinese philosophy, for example, and so on. In the case of philosophy, I'll just, I know a little bit about it, so I may also, since I can't talk about the other things, let me try and focus on that particular topic. If you look at Indian and Chinese philosophy, for example, it seems to be the case that there are fundamental presuppositions which are different between what you could call as the Greek, and then its artificial connection to the European tradition, and let's say the other kinds of traditions which arise in the world. Now, in what sense do these differences matter, or are these differences peripheral different? Because we should remember that there's really nothing called Western philosophy also. There are many different traditions within Western philosophy. There are, if you look at, for example, even in contemporary philosophy, you take something like philosophy of mind, there are so many different people holding different positions. Philosophers are always in a sense of conflict with each other, and that's the task of philosophy, that's the nature of philosophy. So to be able to say there is something homogeneous as Western philosophy and non-Western philosophy is the first problem. But if we overlook that in order to understand something else which I am saying, are there significant differences between the nature of doing philosophy in India or China or Asia and the nature of philosophy which is in the West or European tradition at least? And the first example, the possibility that there are significant differences, that possibility does not come from us. That possibility comes from the most important philosophers in the European tradition, whether it's from John Locke to Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the very important German philosopher, or to Heidegger or to Gadamer, comparatively recent. You see that the voicing of the significant difference between Indian and European philosophy comes from them first. So I want to take them on board first and ask, why is it that a very important, very influential, in my view, a philosopher whom I thoroughly enjoy reading, Edmund Husserl, why would he, who is otherwise so sensitive and very thoughtful about things, would still say something like, a statement like, Indians have no philosophy. There is no philosophy in India. And this was my first source of reflection, and that's why in the abstract I was responding to that point. Because I don't want to start by assuming that Husserl was Eurocentric and he had these opinions about Indians and Asians. I mean, Kant had, and there's no doubt about Kant's views on Africans, whom he said they're so dark that their intelligence must be very low. That universality of Kant is very problematic universality, but I want to give this benefit of doubt to Edmund Husserl and ask, why would he want to say these claims that there is no philosophy in a particular culture, which Gadamer extends to Asiatic culture and says Asiatic cultures, as recent as I think in the late 70s or 80s, do not have philosophy in the sense, they do not have the Greek sense of knowing. The idea of knowledge doesn't become a fundamental theme for these philosophical traditions, and that always puzzled me. So I want to give them the benefit of doubt and ask the question, there is some other reason for which they are saying this, and it is not about being Indian or German or whatever. The British, I think, have a definite problem, and there is a very clear example in the colonial discourse, definitely with Mills, for example, where the construction that Indians do not have, not just philosophy, but mathematics and science and logic, becomes very important as part of the colonial discourse. And there's a very nice piece by Professor M. V. Srinivas where he actually points out that the early writing of the British on Indian mathematics was actually celebratory. They recognized the kind of work which is done in Indian mathematics. But I think it is in this paper that he points out that after 1857, the first mutiny, War of Indian War of Mutiny Independence War, in 1857, immediately all the writings on the nature of Indian mathematics, he says, changes. It's immediately then seen as not being mathematics. What they were doing is not mathematics. So there's a long historical trajectory of the claim that the Indians did not have mathematics or Indians did not have logic because that fits in the particular construction of the society. But then when somebody shows them these mathematical texts and then they have to respond to it, then the British argument was very, very simple. It said, well, that's not really mathematics. So we go to Husserl and show him these philosophical texts. There's a very long tradition of philosophy in India. I mean, it's so long and so detailed and so deep that it's impossible to actually go through, fraction of them, even by philosophers in the Indian tradition. So when he says this and somebody gives him a text of this kind, I would presume his argument would be, well, that's not really philosophy. So what happens in that moment of constructing the boundaries of a discipline is to say, well, certain societies do not really have what I have, and that what I have is defined by you in such a way that the others can never enter into that. Now why? I think in Husserl's case it was a genuine puzzle, and I don't think it was, the kind of a colonial discourse which happens in the British. Part of the problem is that I don't think he understood. Well, first of all, he didn't have access to many of the works in Indian philosophy which was accessible later. And the second problem is I don't think he understood the nature of those texts. So a very classic example, just to illustrate this to you, is from Indian mathematical texts. So when you look at Indian mathematical texts, like one of the greatest Indian mathematicians, Aryabhatta, or look at Bhaskara, there's a very long tradition of Indian mathematics. And as we have, and the historians of mathematics have detailed this very well, while, if you compare the kind of production of mathematics in India and China versus Europe in, pre-origin of modern science, etc., the kinds of work that have been developed in those societies were very, very advanced. Now, you had this kind of a situation where there was something called, you cannot deny that there was something called mathematics in that sense. Then in what sense would these people say this for mathematics? So the first argument which the colonial discourse did was to say that, well, these are not really mathematics because Aryabhatta, for example, the Aryabhattian text is just a set of sutras, it's like a set of lines. It's a short and pithy notations of trigonometric tables and so on, for example, and they don't look like a mathematical text. So the way the argument was posed is this, that these are not mathematical because they do not show a central core of mathematical thinking, which is deduction and proof. These are texts which are just happenstance, they just happen in front of you, and they don't have this idea of demonstration, the Aristotelian demonstration, or the ideas of proof and deduction of a result. So what it does is you have a book of results, and you don't have this kind of a way of arriving at the results. And therefore, we don't know how they came to those results, and that's something they should have worried about, because you just can't get these results. It happened with Ramanujan as late as the 1910s and 1920s. One of the greatest Indian mathematicians, I'm sure if you've heard of this, Bollywood has made him famous with a new movie, The Man Who Knew Infinity. This is a genius who was discovered by a British mathematician, Hardy. He goes to Cambridge and becomes very famous and dies very young and so on. But the same argument which was there in the early traditions is also present in J.H. Hardy, because with Ramanujam, because Ramanujam used to write these texts with amazing results, but you would never be able to see the proofs in that. So Hardy actually civilizes him, and what is the civilizational work there is to show him how to write proof. He had to tell Ramanujam, the importance of proof is as important as a result. So this is a very celebrated thing. It's a fascinating study of how mathematics works and so on. But that idea that these people are all sitting and meditating and getting answers was one of the reasons you said, oh, they didn't have the idea of mathematics until, for example, M.D. Srinivas pointed out that it is a textual strategy. It's not about mathematics. You will not find in the core mathematical text this demonstration and proofs and so on. To find those demonstrations and proofs, there are secondary texts, the commentaries on these texts. So there are a series of texts which he listed out, where he showed how, although there is results are given, it's almost like a guidebook, somebody gives all the results, and if you want to see where it's calculated, you have to go to another book to see it. So I'm just giving you a counter to the argument that, for example, that what Indians did were not mathematics. In the case of philosophy, it becomes, I think, far more difficult because, among other things, the fact that which happened in Indian democracy. I mean, I'm just remembering last month what happened in Tamil Nadu, where the chief minister, she should be the prime minister actually, but she's just the chief minister, just the minister, the head of the state, Jayalalitha, who is she's of not your state, neighboring state. She was ill, and she was in the hospital. And she was so seriously ill that after a few days, I mean, she's really an oligarch. I mean, the Russian mafia has nothing in comparison to this. So she goes to the hospital, and apparently she's ill. And there is no news. Nobody can get news whether she's alive or dead. The doctors cannot give news that, there was a rumor after 1 week that she was dead. But none of the, people went from Delhi to meet her, including the ministers, Sonia Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi from the Congress went to meet her. None of them could meet her. So the news would say they went to the hospital and they inquired about her health with the doctors. And somebody from Tamil Nadu was telling me, these guys are afraid to release the information she's dead because, they would have ransacked the hospital. The hospital would have been in, danger, right? I mean, what I'm trying to say is this is a public figure. There's a certain sense of accountability you would expect of a person of whom nothing is known for 2-3 weeks, but apparently the government is running. Files are being signed and decisions are being taken. and then we have one report that 2 of her close confidants, who are the bureaucrats there, are sitting somewhere in the hospital and running this whole show. And nobody is telling us what is wrong with this woman. What is the real problem? What has gone wrong? Is she going to come out of it? And every day there is a news that somebody from Britain, a very famous doctor from Britain comes, he visits, and then he gives a short press statement. She's getting better. We don't know better from what. And then they got a set of doctors from Singapore, and they also came and said she's getting better, and they left. So now, apparently, then last week, or just before I came, the cabinet met because somebody complained to the governor that you can't run a government without a chief minister. We don't know what has happened. So the opposition leader said she's actually dead. Nobody is saying that. So I think the governor put some pressure on the party, and then they had a cabinet meeting. And you can see this because the picture was carried in all the newspapers. So there's a meeting with all the ministers, and there's a photo of her presiding over the meeting. So without permission of the photo, they will not act. Okay? No, what I'm saying is this. See, this is the point about incommensurability. This is actually about democracy. Tamil Nadu is one of the most vibrant democracies that I know. It's and it's also, this woman who is so powerful in that region that it is, you can't even imagine, all feminist scholars should just study Jayalalitha. Because in a place which is so masochistic, there's a lot of real macho things in Tamil Nadu. It's the only place where, and I'm saying this and I know it's true, even though it may be dangerous to my health, many of these ministers are, real crooks. They're not crooks, they're goons. But she's the only one. When they see her, they'll fall at her feet. It was one of the most remarkable things which happened in Tamil Nadu was when she was arrested for some excess income, etc. She was actually housed in Bangalore, and we were all scared living in Bangalore what kind of riots would happen because of that. And then they had to swear in her other the deputy minister as the chief minister when she was in the jail. So this is a hilarious thing, and it's the only time in my life I have seen a swearing in ceremony of the chief minister and his ministers who are all crying when they are being sworn in. And somebody said so correctly, they said if this guy doesn't cry when he becomes chief minister, he'll be finished. He has to show, because he's so scared of it, he has to show that this is not what he wants. He really wants her to be chief minister, but I'm so sad she's in the jail, but I'm becoming a chief minister. Now, and this is a classic, an example of how you engage with these kinds of, because after all you study societies, you are encountering this. Now, how do you even look at this? And how do you understand this in terms of individual autonomy, democracy? As I said, the kind of vibrant democracy you see in Tamil Nadu, you will never see anywhere. Not in the elections which is happening next door. How do you then make sense of that, right? What kind of frameworks do you need? This is a classic example of how you encounter Indian philosophy or Indian mathematics. Their presentations, the way they appear to you, are so different from the way your own structures, your sense of appearances which happen in life. And therefore, this becomes a very important question for anybody who studies society about how you re-understand questions of democracy and religion and what kind of categories you really need to make sense of these things, right? Now, disciplines know all this. Anthropology does this extensively. India is studied anthropologically by a very large number of people. I'm sure also at the center here and many other centers. The question some people have had in India about the study of these other societies is that how do you make sense of these kinds of experiences of these societies through their own conceptual vocabularies, which anthropology of course wants to do, but also through their intellectual tradition. So it's no longer just saying what categories do they use in order to describe what's happening. So the participant observation extension that I only talk about what the people in the field, the concepts are given by the field and so on. But the concepts in the field cannot make meaning to you unless they are placed within the proper historical trajectory of those concepts. So it's no longer just saying, somebody might say something in the field that the human body is like this, and you could, of course, record it and report it. But to make sense of it is to make sense of the intellectual traditions in which the way these ideas of the human body is conceptualized. Because I'll give you a classic example which illustrates the tension of this. The Dalai Lama is very keen on doing this Buddhism and science interface. They have a lot of debates and seminars on science and Buddhism. And in one of these big meetings, I've been part of some of them. We had one in Sarnath, it's a very important holy place for the Buddhists. And we had this happens in many of these Buddhist science meetings. In this particular meeting, there are these thousands of these monks sitting there. And there was a neuroscientist, a person who works with neurobiology from Europe, a very well-known scientist apparently. She had come from Zurich, if I remember right, Zurich or Geneva. She came to talk about the experiments they do on the monks when they do this, what is called the compassionate meditation. Yeah. So she's looking at compassionate meditation. So they come there and they put all electrodes and stuff. So she was presenting that data, what she has done. And she was saying, there are all these thousands of monks, and she's telling those monks, when you are doing contemplative meditation, this is what is happening to you. So she shows them something is happening in the brain with some photographs and pictures. Now, I hope you see the little bit of a problem here. It's not that she's studying contemplative, I think it's very important that we all find different ways of studying something. But while she wants to tell these people that what is happening to them when they are doing this is explained by a framework of mind and body, which is part of her medical tradition, which may be right, that's not the point, but she doesn't know, forget about engagement, she doesn't even know that the Buddhist meditative tradition is dependent on a theory of body and mind, which is radically different from the theory of body and mind that she holds. It may be true that in the end what she said is the correct thing, and that's the theory of body and mind we have to accept, etc. That's not the question at all. The fact is that there is, so in other words, the argument, this is the point, that the Buddhist argument would be very simple. The contemplative meditative practices for the Buddhists did not fall like the apple on their head. It was developed, they discovered it, or they invented it or whatever, because of their theories of body and mind. In other words, the ways of doing contemplative meditation is not as textual, scriptural, some truth which was given to them, but because they had a theory of body and mind which explains certain things this way, from that they developed certain strategies of thinking and meditating, from which certain things happen. Now, how do you then make sense only of the appearance of contemplative meditation, whatever happens in your brain, without ever engaging with that theory which gave rise to this? So it's almost, and this is what is happening, by the way, in a very big problem in Indian context, right? When people say, they look at contemporary science and say this was also there in our ancient past, everybody gets very angry about it, very rightly so. Because very recently our Prime Minister said something about plastic surgery and everybody was very upset about it. But the point is this, for all of them belong to the same category. Modern science too belongs to the same category as this chap, because what they are saying is, you cannot take a particular practice which has been discovered through years of practice and experiments and modifications, and suddenly removing the theoretical structures which is behind it. So it's like me saying something about electricity here, completely negating everything which is the theoretical structures which led to the discovery of electricity, and which led to our, so all Maxwell's laws, etc. Oh, we don't have to worry about data. I will now explain to you what science is. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't follow that.
You don't?
I don't follow that.
Yeah.
To me, that's not logical. That's an implication. That's an assumption. So why is it that it negates it? I mean, it could negate it if she doesn't actually get into it. But I would have thought that the whole point of these kinds of demonstrations is exactly to offer a way in to the question of the relation between mind and body. So she's not doing that?
No, that's the point.
She's absolutely not doing that?
She's not doing that.
Okay.
So, and that's why I'm saying this without including any motives to her. She's a very good scientist and a very good person also, in the sense, she's not looking down on his meditative practices. She doesn't have that intellectual world which can accommodate a completely different theory of body and mind, which goes counter to everything her own theories of body and mind talk about, right? Now, let me just clarify. So, my point is, how much, if I want to now understand contemplative meditation and give certain kinds of alternate practices, if I want to tell these monks this is what is happening, where are my modes of dialogue with them? And when I may be using the word mind and brain, they are using the word mind and brain, but they are meaning something else completely different. So, this is the point about theoretical structures, is that unless she has a way to actually take into account what they are saying and disagree with it and critique it, that's not the problem. But to even have the common vocabulary to say, look, this is what you're saying the mind and the structure of the body is, but that's not true for the following reasons. The point is that you don't even need a field to engage with that, and instead of even critiquing it. I'll give you another panel, maybe that will be a little more clearer. This is a very good examples in Indian technology. There are very good accounts of this. When the first examples of steel making is from India, like the zinc plants. These are very, very difficult technological mechanisms. Zinc is a distillation thing, etc. And then the Indians were doing enormous amount of zinc and steel. The zinc done at the zinc because of the alloy thing which are used across India for various things. The 5 alloy metals, very, very great expertise in making it. The steel was very important for the Indian thing. The famous examples of Damascus steels came from Indian steel which are exported to the Middle East. The Roman cutlery came from Indian steel which was sent to Rome, etc. So there is a long tradition of steel making which is actually a tandoori process. It's a baked process in clays. And there is a very interesting process with twigs and leaves and stuff like that. Now the British discovers this process and they export that idea of technology. They come back to India and set up the first steel plant. And when they asked the British administrators about the steel, whether and this comes from the subaltern, the blacksmith tradition throughout India. It's not even the so-called elite upper caste there. They were the ones who are producing this kind. A lot of the work, a lot of amazing technologies are coming from that kind of work, from these various class structures, caste structures. Now, when the British were asked about this steel making, you know what they said? They said, well, these people did not know what they were doing. Therefore, the intellectual property, the same thing which happens in intellectual property today. So the intellectual property of that act belongs to us because from Britain they came back with the chemical equation of how steel is formed, and they found that as the theoretical structure which explains this, and not the ways in which they had understood the making of steel. So that is duplicated across in these kinds of things. And again, unlike the British thing, I'm not imputing this to the meditative practice. I'm just saying, talking about the conflict, the kind of obstacles you have in making meaningful sense of very different kinds of experiences and appearances. It's in that sense, but we can pick up more of this if it's not clear, right? So in a sense, these kinds of things are all, so much of it is now there in social theory because of the difficulty of understanding nature, for example, the conceptual terms of selfishness, duty, of non-violence, for example, and so on. So in a sense, what it seems to suggest is that the non-West is a very rich source of creation of experiences, which the West can then reflect upon. Okay, I'm just putting it in this way, in a kind of a polemical sense, but I don't mean it in that sense. But so people can tend to look at the Asian experiences as a field which is available to you for your own rich reflections on that field. Now, how many minutes do I have?
Maybe 5 minutes.
Okay. So let me therefore end by saying how do we make sense of the challenge of making sense of non-Western knowledge traditions of different kind. One is, of course, the historical, and and this is something which is so central to intellectual histories of humanities disciplines that we need to pay attention to it. Because very often when we just use concepts and ideas, we forget the fact that there's a long historical trajectory to those ideas. And the question now is not what kind of ideas help you make sense of the different kinds of experiences in other societies, but what kind of history of ideas do you need to make sense of them. And I don't know how many of you are from philosophy, but there was a very recent piece in May 2016 by two philosophers well known, at least I know of them, J. Garfield and Brian Van Norden. And they wrote this piece in the Stone, but it was published in New York Times, and somebody sent it to me, and then it has been sent to different places. And I thought I'll just read very quickly here from that piece. It's a very short piece. The title is, "If philosophy won't diversify, let's call it what it really is." And Garfield and Brian Norton were both teaching in the US. Now Garfield, I think, is in the National University of Singapore. But anyway, this is what he says, and I'll read very quickly and briefly from that. It's a very simple, small article. And it says this: the vast majority of philosophy departments in the United States offer courses on philosophy derived from Europe and the English-speaking world. For example, of the 118 doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States and Canada, only 10% have a specialist in Chinese philosophy as part of the regular faculty. Most philosophy departments also offer no courses on Africana, Indian, Islamic, Jewish, Latin American, Native American, or other non-European traditions. And then he goes on, they go on to say, given the importance of non-European traditions in both the history of world philosophy and in the contemporary world, and given the increasing number of students in our colleges and universities from non-European backgrounds, this is astonishing. No other humanities disciplines demonstrates the systematic neglect of most of the civilizations in its domain. Not really true, because it also happens in literature. Sheldon Pollock wrote a note for the Global Humanities thing. Sheldon Pollock was at Columbia, pointing out that it's only they analyzed the PhD productions in the US and pointed out only 3% draw upon non-European canons of literary traditions in talking about literature in the US. So this article goes on to say, we each, alongside many colleagues and students, have worked for decades to persuade American philosophy departments to broaden the canons of work they teach. We have urged our colleagues to look beyond the European canon, but it has not. Progress has been minimal. And many philosophers and many departments simply ignore arguments for greater diversity. Others respond with arguments for Eurocentrism that we and many others have refuted elsewhere. The profession as a whole remains resolutely Eurocentric. And you know this is also it's a particular problem of philosophy, very male-centered. It's not just about Eurocentrism, it's also very male-centric. But the point which Garfield and Norden are doing is that he said if this is what it is, they have not been able to change any of this. Then they said they should rename themselves not a Department of Philosophy, but they should call themselves Department of European and American Philosophy. If that's what you want to do, then do that so that you're consistent with what you do, because you're no longer speaking for philosophy yourself, because you don't have to accept the others as philosophical things. And this is a question which a problem we have faced repeatedly, in trying to get people to accommodate different kinds of philosophical traditions. So when I did my book, Indian Philosophy and Philosophy of Science, the reason I did that was very simple. When I looked at philosophy of science as a discipline, they are talking, early Greek is very important. They said Plato and Aristotle and so on. It was also ironic for me that, Aristotle was single-handedly the person who was the greatest obstacle to the origin of modern science. You had to overthrow some of the most important Aristotelian tenets. They normally list 5 major tenets of Aristotelianism before natural science could be accepted. Now, that doesn't mean Aristotle is obviously not relevant for philosophy of science. He is very relevant. But why is that tradition so central to philosophy of science? Because what are they talking about? They're talking about theory of matter, for the question of matter and form, nature of causality, ideas of substance, all these normal, typical topics in philosophy. These same topics are being very deeply discussed in Indian and Chinese philosophies, among other philosophies. So if my task is just to understand what is the nature of, let's say, a scientific object, or how does causality function in science, and I want a theory of causality to make sense of it, then why in principle can I not draw upon different cultures who may have come up with their theories of causality and then reject them and say, look, Aristotelian theory of causality is the correct one, others don't work. Because there's a fake connection between Greek philosophy and modern science. And it's a very artificial construction, an artificial creation. Because the subject topics of philosophical analysis are common to different traditions. So I began asking the question, what could philosophy of science do if I use Indian philosophical categories to address the questions in contemporary philosophy of science? But like all projects, it needs many people to do it. I mean, obviously, all philosophy already grows as major projects of that kind. But at least, I was trying to make the argument why and how one can actually relook at this. So it's a kind of a question of a puzzle for me in that sense. And this is something which is a major question. So as they end, this is what they say, and this is very important because this is the approach I have. And he says, the authors say, this is not to disparage the value of the works in contemporary philosophical canon. Clearly, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with philosophy written by males of European descent. But philosophy has become richer and pluralistic. So along with Kant, teach the Persian philosopher Avicenna, teach along with Nagel's Hilary Putnam, teach Chandrakirti, a very well-known Buddhist scholar, along with then teach Franz Fanon, Vinedu, Lugons, etc., etc. So the idea, and this is the point I've been trying to engage with all our friends here, is that there are very deep problems, but the ways in which one can engage with these problems is also to find ways in which we teach very many different cultural traditions. And it can only happen with this levels of learning which happens with the students who can decide to work on something or the other, who can decide to go in particular directions. There are fundamental problems. It's a very difficult task. One of them is about the question of language and translation. And I will just end with that because the question of language is often being used as a reason why people who are well-meaning, who want to do this kind of a very diverse learning process of different experiences often have, which is that we don't understand what those, I don't understand Chinese, I don't understand Sanskrit, or I don't understand Hindi or whatever, how am I going to use that? And I think there we have to rechange our look of translation, and that's part of our debate project we've been doing with Gordon and others in Canada. And the question of translation, and I'll just end with this because we can discuss this if there's any interest in that. But my argument then is very simple, that the lack of availability of your access to text cannot really be an excuse, because there are secondary texts, there are some primary texts, and translation cannot be used as a gatekeeper for not letting other ideas come in. It is true we have as much trouble with the Greek text or German text or French text, but nobody stops reading Derrida or some part of it unreadable Derrida just because it's, by saying I don't know French, I can't access French. None of us know French, we still quote Derrida all the time. Or we would quote Habermas or Kant, who can't even read his text in German. So why then should Chinese and Sanskrit and Indian thought why should language be used as an obstacle to accessing those thoughts? It is also true that Western academics has built an enormous amount of investment in secondary literature, which allows you certain kind of trust and confidence in secondary literature, and it does not happen in these kinds of traditions. But until that happens, we need to work with what we have. And finally, why am I saying all this? Not because I am from India. I don't know, I don't have a stake to that thing called India or China. But I think because primarily for me, it opens up the richness of perspectives that is available to you. It gives us a kind of a stakeholdership in the global vision that all of you are creating for us to live in. It brings me into the world in which all of us, different communities can participate in the kind of world we create. And finally, that it explicitly brings in questions of ethics into academic knowledge. And this to me was actually the central core of the last book he said, which I did with Gopal Guru, on primarily the question of what is the relationship between ethics and knowledge, and whether the artificial disjunction between ethics and knowledge which happens with the creation of modern science, is that tenable at all, or do we continue to have an ethical engagement with what we do? Gopal Guru's argument that the question of why you are studying, not what you are studying, becomes very important. And that if we reflect sufficiently on why, this is not to stop people studying anything. It's a question of self-reflexivity. It's a lot of it inspired by, ethical approaches to thinking and knowing, like people like Gandhi and so on. So this is not as a way to obstacles of creation. We're not building walls to say you can study this, I can study it, but only the conditions for an ethical approach, ethical creation of knowledge when we study the human others of different kinds of cultures and traditions and so on. And I think among all the places that I've seen, Canada still is a great model and a great source of hope. And I am sure that in this there will be very new directions coming from here. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we have time for some discussion and questions, and I'm not sure where everybody is from, but whether the humanities, social sciences, health sciences, there's something there for everybody.
Yeah.
So we can open it up now for discussion.
It's more of a comment, and then I suppose you could, gather questions from that. Well, I was a science student in school, and then went on to literature, English literature, and then came back to science, went to law, and then came back to science through the science and technology studies. And I'm an STS student here. I have three comments. The first one is the connections between philosophical traditions. And I think there are connections. It's just that it's been up to individual choices to explore or not to explore. And having been exposed to, I didn't study philosophy on a formal basis, but philosophy that is infused through culture and also through literature traditions. one main point of connection between Indian philosophy and Greek and the modern Western epistemology of technology is Heidegger. Heidegger theory on the essence of technology, which I've read and reread and enjoyed reading, among many other readings, is connected to Plato. Plato's, not on Republic, but Plato's theory on technology, his dialogues, as well as Dvaita, Adi Shankara's philosophy. Just that it's not being explored, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I mean, there are connections if one wants to delve in it, if one wants to write on it. The second one I see is on the technology of constructing maps. For instance, how he explicitly recognizes that during the British colonial period in India, the Indian conventions of mapping were taken forward as conventions of British mapping, the Indian colonial map, which goes into explicit dialogue later on about tradition, partition, and so on, but these were conventions of mapping which the history of ideas that you touch on, and sort of give the risk scholar in the Western tradition acknowledging the Indian conventions of mapping. So, I mean, it's not as if it's completely absent. I would just like to point out that there are convergences of traditional acknowledgements, people writing about different books, traditions, and the problematic of the division of traditions seems to me connected to what you read out as the final passage of how academia is structured in certain countries. But then that's the business of academia, because the academia is appealing to local audiences and local consumers and customers. So whether there are international departments, international philosophy, international literatures, international politics, these are subdivisions within each of these departments. So that's my comment.
Yeah. No, I agree. You can just respond very quickly on this. That, for example, Heideggerian scholars would be a bit troubled if you tell them that they find Advaita and Heidegger. And some Indian scholars would be very happy.
Asia, but I'm very interested in, from an outsider's perspective, in indigenous epistemologies in the academy. So how are native persons understood in the academy? And it's usually as kind of cultural avatars or as witnesses, especially tragic witnesses, but hardly ever as kind of intellectuals. And that's true not just of kind of traditional indigenous knowledges, which might look quite different from what we do in the academy, but even kind of scholarship produced in peer-reviewed journals is not cited or recognized, right? And that's partly because of institutional divisions of labor. So you get South Asian studies and philosophy, and you also get indigenous studies and philosophy or indigenous studies and sociology, and then you don't professionally, your professional competence doesn't demand that you know these scholars, right? So one of the things that's interesting to me is how we produce this in the academy, which is on your last point. And I just thought of two other nice examples. One is the problem of conscientiousness. Like, why do we cite Weber over and over again? Because we learn that he's a central figure. We want our students to be in conversation with other people who know who the central figures are, and so we cite them. We go to objectively highly ranked, highly impacted journals, and these are usually Ivy League American writers, mostly men. In sociology in 2010, the top 10 cited sociology articles, 5 were written by 2 men in 2 universities, right? So you're a conscientious pedagogue, you want to get your students knowing who the central people are, you reproduce these kind of exclusions, and you never have to say it's because you're only interested in white American men, right? You just you're just conscientious. And another instance is that when you do try and challenge things, you face enormous difficulty. So my late colleague Roxana Ng, who was at the University of Toronto at OISE, which is itself a very special institution that allows this kind of pedagogy, had a course specifically on traditional Chinese medicine, in which Qigong meditation was part of the course. And this just faced enormous resistance from students, even students who subsequently became sympathetic to her approach, because they said, we didn't come to do a PhD and sit around and meditate or whatever. We're minds and we're here to learn serious stuff, and you're not doing your job. So there's serious institutional obstacles. And she was called into the office and told she should reconsider her course content and think about doing something a little bit less controversial and provocative. So there's all sorts of very exhausting work that has to be done. When you're trying to challenge these things in the academy, I'm very interested in the kind of pragmatic aspects of the difficulties of doing that. But anyway, I just loved it was so helpful.
Thank you. Just a quick this point about this question about politics of citations and so on. Yesterday in this conference, we were a very well-known person was in that conference. When I raised a similar question about STS media and so on, she said, basically she said, none of you guys write good enough stuff for us to read. And then I told her that that's a very fair, comment, and that's okay, we are willing to accept that. But I also said that, you are the people who make a paper well known. It's only by being picked up by others and teaching it to my students and making 10 people cite that the paper becomes a well-known paper. There are papers, especially in humanities and sources, it's not like science papers where there are some clear-cut, results and so on. So it's this point is there, I understand. But I think the only way out is, as I said, exposure, because I really believe that, prejudice is not, there are a few people, you can't do anything with Donald Trump even if he's in your class. But I think we can do a lot with telling people what there is, and there will be resistance, we will have to face. It's so difficult to teach Indian philosophy in India. The resistance is very deep, for various reasons. They'll say that for some reason or the other. So that's okay. We just have to keep on telling people, and somebody will then figure out that this is very interesting, that's not.
Okay, again,
thank you very much for your presentation. Very interested. A few comments. I think that your remark about not wanting to impute motives, it's very helpful. Nobody I know of would have ever said that Joseph Needham was in any way opposed to Chinese science. Yeah. Quite the contrary, but pretty much everybody now studying the history of Chinese science say he was asking the wrong question, which was, of course, why didn't the scientific revolution take place there? In fact, it was asked with a good motive, right? But it sort of was a distraction, because the real problem is the harder one, which he spent his life doing, is trying to understand Chinese science. And so there is a lot of work that has to be done in that. With respect to philosophy in the Anglo-American tradition, there are problems peculiar to that tradition in the 20th century, where a good deal of philosophers in that tradition saw at one point themselves as scientists of a peculiar kind, and really had a deep shape on a deep impact on the shape of the field, right? And I think that probably didn't help for other kinds of traditions of all sorts, including even some European ones, getting profiled as philosophy. They were shunted off to something else. So you can do that in Asian studies, right? If you want to study that stuff, or somewhere else. So it's an interesting problem. With respect to literature, I think in some ways it may be the deepest problem, because it's also had the longest recognition. Goethe 200 years ago was saying, look, I was telling his friend Eckermann, the Chinese were writing novels by the hundreds while we were still living in the forests, right? And we're going to pay attention to this, but it's a long process of getting that sort of stuff even into the curriculum. In a basic sort of way. So I don't really know what to say beyond. I think you're asking great questions, and it seems to me the way of addressing them. It's a long project. You're trying to turn around a great big ship that's got a lot of momentum.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think you're very right. I mean, sometimes it's daunting, but I also want to, pose the question as a problem for us in the sense, because this is, there's very little I can say about how Western institutions work or should work. But I'm saying this has become a problem within academics in India itself, where the difficulty in teaching, as I said, different kinds of Indian, for example, you talk about literature, the aesthetic theories in studying literature, very often you have the standard literary theories and people teach them in all our literature courses. For people who have been wanting to incorporate Indian theories of aesthetics into teaching of aesthetics, there's a very strong Kashmir Shaivism tradition of poetics and literary criticism. It's been very difficult. So I'm saying that's an internal struggle we have, and also the struggle about the asymmetry of representation which impacts many of what we are able to teach and what our students learn about their own experiences. And I'm just reminded, because the Anglo-American thing is so bad, as I'm sure you know this very well, but the analytical philosophers probably hate the continental philosophers more than they would have problems with Indian and Chinese philosophers, So that may be there, but also there are convergences among them in different phases, regarding scientific philosophy and so on. So yeah, I'm as I said, I'm just using this excuse of talking about the situation in Western universities and what one does through pedagogy, but actually I'm very worried about the way we contribute. How do our communities contribute to the knowledge of the world in which we want to have a share in imagining its future? That's all. And that is also very daunting, but...
So I'm doing my master's degree in biology, and in my undergrad, I took a lot of courses on evolutionary theory. And the problem with those courses isn't necessarily that, they only talk about theories that were created by white European men. It's what's missing from when they talk about those theories, right? So there is a book called Crania Americana, which is essentially a book of the skull shapes of different Native American tribes and also different African tribes, and comparing that to why they're so dumb and why slavery is okay. And this was backed by every evolutionary biologist that we celebrate in our evolutionary biology courses, including Charles Darwin, right? As to this is why this is okay, right? Other evolutionary biologists, for instance, and I apologize for using this term, but there was a woman who was referred to as the Venus Hottentot, whose genitals were on display in a Paris Museum of Natural History until the 1970s. Because she wasn't treated like a human being, she was treated like an animal, and this is part of evolutionary theory. Look at how fancy her genitals are compared to everybody else's, right? Like how disgraceful and demeaning to a person. Yeah. But we never talk about that in biology at all, right? Regardless of how political it is, you have to go outside and search that on your own. And I think that, especially, being South Asian through my parents, and knowing that, back home, like a lot of my cousins and, extended family and family friends who are also studying biology go through this as well. This is also missing from their curriculum, right? And as a person of color, to know that I'm, celebrating and reading all these theories for people who have actively said that it's okay that, my people are slaves because we're stupid, right? Because of our skull shape. And I think that that's something that, at least the talk today, sort of backs up, and I don't know if there are any other scientists in the room. I really wish they were here, because none of our talks are ever like this. But yeah, so we did get an email about the event, but I don't think any of them decided to come. No, they live in 3 buildings, and anything outside of those buildings they just don't go to. So yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, thank you for
So, I'm a fan, okay, and I love the work, a lot of people are doing, but I do have a critique of even the way we talk. We, I'm saying we, as in people who are working on the non-Western history of science, and also, with apologies to you, apologies to not in advance, but the thing is,
So in a lot of theoretical frameworks, trans now comes up, which is hugely problematic to me. I just, for me, in my own work, for example, I have had very, a great difficulty in making any theoretical connections with the work I'm doing and trying to find frameworks which are different from Eurocentric frameworks or the outsider frameworks to study, science, this very hybrid kind of science happening in the 19th century India. So my critique is, you ended your talk even by saying that ethical ways of thinking such as inspired by Gandhi. So you do say that, and sure, Gandhi did great stuff, but so this year has been a huge year of reflection because of another workshop that happened at YCAR, which was engaging caste in the diaspora, and it's all connected. For me, it's all beginning to connect very, very much. Where Gandhi himself becomes very, very problematic because he puts up this front, but he's actually very Hindu. He's actually very right-wing Hindu. He's not. He actually calls the people Harijan, and no Dalits want to use that word at all anymore. It's derogatory. They want to use Dalit, for that reason. And so earlier this year when I attended this, and you will actually like that. I attended this round table on caste where there were 3 people, and only those 3 people in the room were actually Dalit scholars. So there was Professor Chinmaya Jingam, who was at Carleton, and there's Sundar and Vartharaja, and then was Sundarajan, who is a Dalit activist in the United States. Now, the 2 of them have opted to kind of almost come out of academia because a lot of that work is happening outside of academia. But, for example, the National Hindu Foundation in the United States, as you might know, is very, very active in demolishing these talks of caste. The center at Columbia was supposed to be named after Ambedkar, but they said they won't get funding because most of these chairs in North America are funded by the National Hindu Foundation, and the billionaires were all right-wing Hindu fundamentalists. So there's, if you talk of education, there's a very fundamental problem in that where caste dictates. And in this roundtable, Professor Jingam, he asked us, really to question our caste privilege. Every scholar in that room, and every scholar, even whether you're looking at Indian academia or academia in the United States or Canada, you look at most of the PhD students, you look at most of the professors, you're looking at Brahmins and Kshatriyas, upper caste people who pervade academia, and they brought up the same question, that it is so important that, if I'm writing about a Dalit scholar, or in my case, if I'm writing about a lower caste artist who is unidentified in making their drawings, I can only to a certain degree tell their story because that is not my lived experience. But when a Dalit writer or a Dalit professor is, if a Dalit scholar is writing about their experiences or the experiences of their peoples, it becomes, only then it becomes authentic. But we're a long way away from that. Even in that room, when I attended that, out of the 30 people in the room, 3 people were Dalit scholars, and they were invited to talk. That's why they were there. So that's problematic. So that itself is a problem. But when we kind of, other thing is, when we keep talking about the, even using terms in our, I think the kind of activism also has to come where we need to stop saying others, where we need to stop saying, that's totally my point of view. But also, citing Gandhi as saying, that he, this ethical ways of thinking. Because I think a lot of his ways were very unethical. So I have a problem with that.
Yeah, let me clarify very quickly. In fact, much of what you say about Dalit lived experience is really the subject of our book, Cracked Mirror. I hope you have seen it.
Yes, of course.
Then the whole debate begins with that.
No, I love it.
Yeah. No, what I'm saying is, yes, it's something which we agree. I agree totally with you on that. And it's really been Gopal and a project to extend this, and we are doing our second book on following that, the idea of social. So yeah, I think that, to accept what you're saying. The point about Gandhi, which I mentioned, was just, maybe passing, but the reason I was saying that is the question of how you think about ethics in the context of knowledge.
Right.
Now, I'm not to give you Gandhi as a paradigm example of what everything that Gandhi does or whatever he does. Sure. I'm giving us an example of a thinker who is accessible enough to ask this question about the relationship between ethics and knowledge. The point about knowing and thinking, because I also thought people may know more about Gandhi. But yes, not only Gandhi, I mean, every thinker who has said anything meaningful about any of this will have various kinds of problems, you know. So I'm saying, if you say Heidegger, somebody will say he's a Nazi, you'll say Husserl, you'll say something else, you know, or the white male or the privileged female, you know, all that stuff. So I'm not even disputing the problems and the problems of invoking that. Yeah, definitely. It was just about this larger problem of how to think about it, for example. And what are the, I mean, there are many thinkers we could, of course.
Yeah, but that itself,
yes,
I think that
agree.
itself becomes a barrier when things are thinking of issues that it's not easy. There's no easy solution.
Yes.
No, I know what I'm saying.
That's only very limited context.
Thanks.
I realised I didn't give you a chance to respond to the silences of science.
It's my favorite topic. I can go on about it and how it's been so difficult to engage with the scientists and get them to, really engage with the questions of STS. I mean, that's why, Canada particularly has one of the, in my own understanding of it, one of the best STS programs in the world. So many different STS people, history and philosophy of science and so on. There is at least you don't have the problem we have in India with the scientists, which is that here at least you have professional groups which do history and philosophy of science. In India, it's the scientists who take over that also.
Yeah.
So they only want to talk about history, they only talk about philosophy of science and so on. So, we have lost the grand struggle of trying to mediate between science and philosophy and history and so on.
Yeah.
So often we just go our paths.
At York, there is a pretty big divide because there's a lot of spectrums between the different disciplines, right? And from biology, I can only speak on the spectrum within biology. So you come from like molecular to physiology all the way to like environmental ecology, right? So I'm in the little nook between physiology and environmental ecology. So I'm kind of dab all across the spectrum whilst I'm doing my research. And there is a huge divide among biologists where, through advances in scientific technology, the molecular biologists feel like this is more modern, our machines are fancier, this is what the new thing is to do, and therefore this is better. Whereas the environmental biologists are still doing research using methods and tools that were used, 50, 60, 70 plus years ago. Right, field work, collecting actual samples from real animals, rather than raising them in a lab and then using, fancy electron microscopes to look at blood smears or whatever, right? There is this like big level of condescension from the molecular biologist to the environmental biologist for this specific reason, and the biologists as a whole come together to be condescending towards people who are in scientific studies, because they're studying science through more of a social scientific lens rather than a scientific lens, or so they think, right? And as someone, I was fortunate enough in my undergraduate to take many philosophy courses. Not everyone else did, right? That's because in high school I was fortunate enough to go to one of the few high schools that offered philosophy. Not all high schools offer that in Canada. And it was a big issue because of religious reasons that people didn't want high school students to be studying philosophy. Right, and that's what sparked my interest, is take so many philosophy courses, including philosophy of science, in my undergraduate degree for fun. They weren't counted towards any of my credits. I just took them because I wanted to take them. And not a lot of students would do that because there are very strict guidelines to the courses you can take, and you have to meet certain degree requirements in order to graduate, right? I worked my way around that because of my interest, right? So, I mean, there's a big gap between the two for that reason, where they think they're better, or they think that the perspective that they have is more accurate than any perspective that could come from scientific studies, right? And then they refused. I know many people who I work with who have said to me, to my face, that, see, in Asia, they don't know that the environment is something that you're supposed to take care of. And what can I say? I want a job after. I can't really, bring up an argument. This person is my advisor. I can't say anything to them. But on their own, they've learned, and their opinion has changed now, right? But the whole idea of global politics, especially with respect to the environment, is completely absent because they don't take those courses unless they actually look for them, right? And I think that putting it on an individual that you should look for it on your own, that's not solving the problem at all. In fact, that's the reason we have a problem, right? So, yeah, I mean, at least from what I've seen at York, that bridge between scientific studies and the scientists just isn't there. Because the scientists refuse to listen to anyone else, like look in on them and then critique them, who they don't deem a scientist.
I have a couple of questions. Let me just go. When you were talking earlier about the compassion meditation, I had read those studies, and that's why like my ears kind of perked up. So I did my undergraduate in geography and psychology, and in psychology it's actually sorry, probably have Kale and it's actually a Bachelor of Science, so it's very positivist, very empirical. Like if you don't really have the evidence, then it's not, you can't really account for it. And then I was talking to a family friend who's actually a naturopathic doctor, and she said that her more like epistemology, and that more epistemology, is that there are so many different variables in the body, and that if you can't always like test cause and effect for everything, but if you know that something works, like for example, exercise. Like we've known for ages, if you exercise, if you eat more vegetables, like that's good. If you sleep enough, that's good. And like you can't always like now we can do tests on that, but it's like those are the causes for a lot of ways to prevent diseases, but we don't always have that. It's like before those microscopes, like you would know that, and it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to explain it. But anyways, I was just wondering, so my questions are, what is the philosophy, and I don't know if you could talk on this or not, but what is the philosophy of, like Buddhist philosophy on the mind and body, of the way of knowing the mind and body? And my second question is, I, as a scholar, so right now I'm doing geography, is my master's, but I'm using psychology, like part of the geography. So like I'm doing research on urban public policy and how folks conceptualize urban public policy. So it's a lot of the conception. But how do I, as a scholar, also, because I am very influenced by Buddhist philosophy, but I don't want to appropriate it. So I don't, like, I want to do it its justice, like I want to cite things and obviously like source it back to scholars, but how do I, like I'm Latin American, but I'm still very Western and Westernized, like I grew up here. How do I, as like a Westerner, not appropriate Buddhist philosophy? But I don't know if you can speak to
So
those.
yeah, very briefly, because it is a very vast point. But I think the question you're asking is interesting because, you know, it probably tells us how we probably can approach these kinds of questions you have, right? Now, there are, of course, very good authoritative translations and also secondary work on Buddhist theory of body, theory of mind, etc. Now, one way I find, for me personally speaking, useful way of engaging with this multiplicity of these huge texts is to really ask myself, how does this help me resolve a particular problem that I have? So whatever is the problem that you are engaging with, right, vis-a-vis geography or body or psychology, whatever.
Yeah.
What are the kinds of resources I'm looking at to resolve that particular puzzle or problem that I have? And that allows me an entry into, at least I know what I am going to do with what I'm trying to be, rather than encounter this huge, it's like encountering the Himalayan range and not knowing where to go, what to do, right? And I think this question about authenticity, appropriation, etc. must all be kept aside, because the only way, in a larger context, the only way we can do it is ask the same questions you ask to, say, Indian, Chinese, Buddhist philosophy, as you would do to any other tradition at all. That's all. If you want to draw upon a French writer or a German writer versus this, ask the same kind of questions. Do you feel you're appropriating the French writer? Are you feeling like you're very uncomfortable with the French writer? I'm just giving you an example, right?
I just don't want to romanticize Buddhist philosophy. Like when I'm talking about compassion in my rating, and I'm like, oh, compassion is amazing, but like I don't want it to sound, because there are like, I guess maybe this is answering my own question, but it's like it's also advised to, if you're going to practice compassion meditation, like also be aware that other feelings can come up too.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
No, I'm just saying, yeah, I don't think romanticization should have to come in the
Yeah.
way, because, yeah, I'm saying we may tend to like, all of us like certain writers, all of us like certain texts, and we will draw more from them, you know. But I guess the academic training will give you sufficient resources to make an argument, may, you know, do those kinds of things. So definitely there will be a thing, and also to expand on this in geography, for example, really wonderful work, both from Buddhist and other traditions, Chinese, Japanese, etc., on the idea of place and sacred places and so on, sacred geographies, of course. But really, the conceptualization of place and space is really fascinating in these different traditions. And you might find, you know, some of those works which you might find interesting.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is just a quick one. I will talk to you later about the question I have, because I didn't want it to be misunderstood, because as you know, the project I have is on, is about in philosophy to a certain extent, but also the way that certain kinds of meditative practices and so on in India are being used in the West, etc. So I was just interested in whether your issue with the Swiss neurologist had to do with intellectual appropriation, or the fact that she was trying to teach these monks their own kind of business from a Western point of view. But we can talk about that later. Just this last anecdote, because everyone's finished, right? So with respect to that last comment, you should know that this question of cultural appropriation is very acute in Canada in particular. Yeah, I mean, because of a lot of reasons, but particularly because of the way that we have continued to colonize indigenous peoples in this country. We are, you know, sometimes I would say overly reflexive, and we become paralyzed. For example, you guys probably know about this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but last year when I was in India, I heard about either a student or a faculty member at the University of Ottawa who was teaching yoga for disabled people for free. Okay? She's just doing this. The students rebelled and said, "You are culturally appropriating this Eastern Indian practice. You have no business doing it here." I thought it was outrageous. I don't know what you think, but you know, this is the sort of thing people are getting into trouble over. This is the kind of sensitivity we're hearing about. How do I do this? Because how do I not sound like a colonial? But you don't need to answer. I'm just mentioning that it was interesting.